of a different dynamic right there, because people have already thought, by the time we get the phone call, the community has already thought about why it is that they want to preserve space for the creative sector. They've already thought about that. So there's been many years of contemplation about that particular subject. But we start with a process called a preliminary feasibility study, which sounds very corporate. But what we try to do is meet as many different people from different sectors as we possibly can to find out why they think this is important and what they want to accomplish. And then we try to meet with people, and this is kind of a new thing, that nobody really knows in any of these groups. And how we find them is very interesting. Because we generally ask artists how to find the people who are off the grid, not on the list, not associated with any arts organizations, so that we can find those people who are doing really interesting things that wouldn't necessarily come to an event like this, for example. And it's super important to find those people because also they tend to be a little bit younger. And sometimes if you only invite people to a focus group, for example, you will get middle-aged people, and really you want to get a nice cross-section of these folks. And all of our projects end up multi-generational, but you have to really work at getting to the 8-year-olds and the 80-year-olds. The in-between is easier, but each side of the spectrum is harder to reach. Yeah.
Joe, I asked you the same question, but putting a little different spin on it, because you're co-locating the business in the barn, so you're sort of part of that economy. So I'd say, how are you, as a business owner, but also in a space like the barn, the ethos of the barn, how does that impact your expectations for yourself?
Okay, so I guess I was more thinking of the expectations that I have of the barn, just as a typical person. But then you'll have to ask me that second part of the question again, because it's like, my brain is just like, doesn't work that way. One thing at a time. All right, so my expectations of the barn are, kind of based around our mission and vision, which we talk about Renaissance, we talk about collaboration, we talk about, what was the third? It was something else. Community center, community arts center. So I would hold the barn, as being a board member, holding the barn accountable to progression of the community while keeping the community involved. And what was the second part?
As the business owner, what are your expectations of yourself, particularly when taking in light, how do you play in that ecosystem? You have expectations of the barn. How's that self-referential for you and how you conduct your business?
You know what? I feel like other people inside of the barn want more from, the barn as an organization than maybe I need. I go in there and I'm very like, I'm already running on all cylinders, but I want the culture to kind of just continue that collaboration. Yeah. Hold on. Can you say it one more time?
I would say your expectations.
My expectations of the barn.
Well, of yourself as a business owner. Do you owe anything to the barn, or are you in the barn because you feel like your business should do more than just be a business, for instance?
Okay, yeah. So I do feel like I'm a kind of a vessel for the collaboration. I feel like I need to involve, if anybody doesn't know, the barn is separated kind of into two sides. One side is the live workspace for artists, and the other side is the creative arts business incubator. I feel like my job is to kind of meld all of that together a little bit sometimes, but and it's usually just through creative projects. I'm working on a documentary with one of the artists on the artist side about Henry Johnson, for instance. I've worked on projects, with one of the studio renters on a swing dance class and orchestra performance. So yeah, just kind of continuing to fulfill the mission and values of that.
So you raised an interesting point. I'm going to kind of over to Bert now in terms of, you know, the creative content that you're producing. You know, Henry Johnson, obviously, you know, war hero of that neighborhood. Henry Johnson Boulevard is the main thoroughfare through the Arbor Hill neighborhood. You know, Bert, how much is the creative content that flows from the artists who are in AS220, how much of that do you find is influenced by the community that the organization is in, or, you know, vice versa? And, you know,
well, complicated question. There's so much creative activity that happens at AS220, I almost take it for granted at this point. But that is also spun out throughout the entire community. So we were the first really artist-led space that provided access to artists at that period of time in the province's history. Now there are numerous artist-owned and run spaces, all of which consulted with us when they were trying to get going. We've also been the fiscal agent for a number of other nonprofits, youth leadership programs and youth advocacy programs, from College Visions and College Access Program to Province Student Union, where students are organizing themselves to advocate for themselves within the schools, public school system. So our influence has been huge within our community, and that's begun to spread nationally, internationally. In fact, me and Wendy were just seeing each other, and just were in Memphis. She was working on a project, one project in Memphis, and I was working on another project in Memphis, and we managed to hook up for a minute. We were in Alaska together as well at one point, in Anchorage, Alaska together. So, you know, I think doing something, right, is always generates other kinds of things. I think a relationship to this conversation, as it was framed for me, about the idea of access to social equity and this term creative placemaking. So if I might just spend a little bit of time riffing on that. So this term creative placemaking, obviously we've been doing creative placemaking before they had a term for it, right? Kind of interesting. Not bad for our work, not that they catered to term for it. But there are some key figures in this conversation. Of course, for those that don't know, there's a guy named Richard Florida. There's a lot of criticism about him, but he wrote a book, The Rise of the Creative Class, which kicked off a lot of this language, I think, that made it kind of universal. But a lot of the issues that we have seen really do have to do with access and sort of social equity. And how is this creative placemaking ensuring that people within a particular community where projects are happening, like was discussed earlier, are actually benefiting and also having access to this. So I think the conversation with the foundations and stuff is starting to turn a little bit. Even though a lot of foundations are nationally, Kresge, Ford, and others have sort of jumped on this bandwagon, I think what they're beginning to discuss, and I've had the privilege of being a part of some of these conversations, is the idea of historical community organizing approaches and techniques. So how do we take, fast forward, a lot of this kind of legacy that was established in the 60s and 70s and later, 60s and 70s really, around community organizing, and how do we bring that, fast forward that, and begin to marry that to this idea of creative placemaking? You know, so I think this term, you know, foundations are trending, and they usually work around 5-year cycles. And they talk to each other, and they try to compound each's investment. So they'll come up with a theme, creative placemaking is one of them, and they all say, well, I'll kick in this much, I'll kick in this much, to sort of amplify the potential impact of that on a nation-wide scale, and also as a way to impact policy, okay, at all levels, from federal to state to municipal. So we're kind of at the end of that window, in a sense, as these trends tend to happen. And I think a lot of the foundations and a lot of people who worked in this field of creative placemaking, so to speak, quote, quote, really believe that it is a good idea and that it should have a long life. And that this idea of a creative economy and the kinds of jobs of the future really are really jobs that come out of this sort of way of thinking. So how do we give it a long life as opposed to a short life? And I think community organizing, social equity, and a lot of the sort of class and equity issues that we've sort of got to in this country have to be part of that conversation. And we can talk about techniques and different ways we all approach that work if we want, but I think I've said enough for now. Should we move on?
I think the most profound example of when we've come across challenges of social equity was in our project that we just completed last year in East Harlem that has a grand opening actually this next weekend. It was an old school, abandoned school at East 99th and 3rd in New York City. And we had 53,000 applications for 90 units of live workspace.
Excuse me? 53,000 applications.
Yeah. It's not something that we were prepared for. It's not something anyone was prepared for. We had to hire 30 people for 3 months just to go through those applications because it was a tax credit project, so you had to go through every single application. But the equity piece was addressed before we looked at those applications because the city council member for that area was Puerto Rican descent, I should say. She was very passionate that at least 50% of those units be reserved for working artists in that zip code. So that meant that, or in that community, New York is divided into community boards, and it was community board 11, so they had to be a resident of community board 11. Turns out that 70% of the applicants came from community board 11 after all was said and done. We had no problem with that, but that was a way for the city to address some of the issues of potential inequity of people coming into the neighborhood who weren't there in the first place. And there can be, people can be very sensitive to that, and I get it. And I think that you should put something in place so that very local, hyperly local residents have first dibs at some of these spaces, if they qualify in other ways. So.
That's great. I'm going to read a quote, and we were just talking about this gentleman, Theaster Gates, who is, controversial, but certainly renowned. He calls himself a cultural planner. It's probably, I guess, a somewhat appropriate term. But sort of to this point, one of the things he says is, artists have to live passionately and deeply, share what they want, do what they can. We do not owe service to community any more than a business professional does. I don't think it should be demanded of artists to become community activists either. I do believe that artists, unlike others in the world, do more of what they do from a place of conviction, and that quality could have an astounding impact on a place. For those artists who believe that part of conviction includes engaging deeply with people in places outside of the gallery, space, studio, or traditional, it's awesome because there's a tremendous amount of need. How do you, there's the organization, and then there are the artists that you serve in the organization. I'm going to start with Jamel on this one because this is almost, again, a question in reverse for you, but how do you reconcile your artists to that greater community? How do you get your artists in the community? How do you get them involved? Can you require that? And is that hurting or helping your mission?
Okay, I'll speak for myself for, I guess, the first part is I spent many of my formative years in Arbor Hill, so I feel like it's made me who I am, so I feel indebted to kind of give back to that. I have a lot of friends who, I have a friend who went to Harvard from inside of Arbor Hill, and it's like, he just wants to get out of here, but I feel like I have to give something back. It's really tough to have someone care about your community. You can't just put that into them. You can't just make them do that. One of the things that we are doing at the Albany Barn is through our our artist interviews, and we're trying to find people who are very community oriented, and just kind of set the baseline there. And then also, what is the next part we're doing?
Which is the direct requirement.